I owe much to some of the speakers who are participating in this conference, in particular Donald, certainly Peggy and Ron, and I would like to thank them for the reasons they know. It's my pleasure to introduce Donald. I believe he became the youngest professor full professor in British history in a major. Am I wrong?
It's not as grand as that sounds. It was in the subject of history, not in history.
Okay. Yeah. In some ways, often history probably. So this is an important British analytical philosophy. Donald Bloxham is Richard Paris Professor in History at the University of Edinburgh. He is the author of The Final Solution, A Genocide, Oxford University Press, Genocide, the World Wars and the Unweaving of Europe, the Raphael Lemkin Prize-winning The Great Game of Genocide, Imperialism, National the Destruction of the Ottoman Empire, A Genocide on Trial, and edited volumes, in particular one I used last semester to teach comparative the Oxford Handbook of Genocide, which is truly excellent. He is writing a book on the role of moral thought in historianship, and he will talk today about the great powers and the Armenian question, eve of genocide.
Right. There goes. Can you hear me? Yeah. Right. Sorry, Stefan, for the graceless intervention in your introduction, and thank you for the introduction itself. This is it's a real honour to be here again, and this is being recorded, I understand, or streamed live, and I think it's conventional in these situations to say my views do not represent the views of X, where X is one of I do hope it may not be the case that these views actually represent my own views, because it's sometimes as I worked on this subject and putting this paper together actually reminded me of views that I didn't remember I had. And certainly listening to and reading Peggy's paper, some of the points that I made in my 2005 book, I might like to revise a little bit actually. I'd like to thank Stefan. He was very kind in thanking me just now. I'd like to thank him too, because in his very generous biography earlier, one thing he didn't mention was his own contribution to Armenian biography, which, while not quantitatively huge, has been qualitatively vital. And I refer here specifically to his work on late 19th century work on agrarian reform and inter-ethnic relations in Eastern Anatolia and Cilicia too, which is absolutely fundamental work, I think, and needs to be fed into any serious overview of Armenian genocide historiography in creating the preconditions of the genocide. Now today, I suppose mentioning Stefan's work and Peggy's work, this means also that I'm only talking about a very specific aspect of the Armenian question in the late 19th and early 20th century today. Only one aspect of it. This is by no means a complete explanation of the development of tensions that lead up to genocide in 1915 to 16. It's just one element of it, and it's the element on which I suppose my book focuses most, which is the creation of what you might call a sort of inner enemy, outer enemy stereotype from the perspective of Istanbul. The idea that entirely paranoid, entirely, very significantly almost racist in some sense, but the sense built up over perhaps previous 40 or 50 years of international diplomacy and internal developments in the Ottoman Empire, that there is some sort of hoops between the internal Armenian population and great powers who are themselves Christians. I mean, to pick up on Peggy's metaphor of blacks that she used so effectively at the end of her paper, in some sense you've got blacks in cahoot with an external population of blacks, right? That's, and you are the United States of America, and it's that sort of dynamic that I want to talk a bit about today. It's about the question of external influence in internal reform question. in short. And what I'm not doing, of course, here is in any way detracting from the moral of the Committee of Union and Progress or any of its provincial associates or any of those people who murder en masse or individually on their own account in 1915 to 16. I am, of course, suggesting that moral responsibility remains with them, but I'm also suggesting that some moral responsibility, however indirectly, also extends to other powers and possibly say to the likes of Britain. And there's nothing to say here that what is a moral responsibility, obviously. As it were, that the moral responsibility is some sort of finite.
Louder, please.
Sorry, how's that now? Is that okay? There's nothing to say that moral responsibility is some sort of finite quantity, I guess, that has to be sort of subtracted from one party in the degree that it's added to another party. So that's my, if you like, the moral framing point to my presentation here. If Napoleon's invasion of Egypt had helped return Europe's attention to what was fondly called the Near East after conflict in Europe, then Europe's defeat of Napoleon meant that Britain stepped into France's pre-Napoleonic shoes as a supporter and commercial partner of the Ottoman Empire. Britain, seeking to contain Russian expansion, maintain the European balance of power, maintain British hegemony in the Eastern Mediterranean, now looked to combat the advancement of Russian influence in the Ottoman lands, Persia, and Central Asia. The beginning of the Great Game between Russia and Britain went hand in hand with the development of the so-called Eastern Question into the major threat to European stability in the Century 15 Congress of Vienna. Ottoman economic stability and development would, in British eyes, be underpinned by liberalised trade relations, though a precondition for all that was the security of life and particularly property for all, as stipulated in the famous 1839 Tanzimat Reform Decree. Ottoman development would also create another market for British surplus manufactures, which in turn tied in British business and investment interests with the future of the Ottoman Empire. Thus, it was necessary to force open the Ottoman trade door. The complementary 1838 Anglo-Turkish Commercial Convention undermined Russian commercial advantages by abolishing restrictive and protectionist practices and fixing import-export tariffs, though not removing the increasingly hated capitulation system. Now, despite some measures of internal economic reform, in particular the toll of the Crimean War, the major military manifestation of Anglo-Russian antagonism, the Crimean War was international borrowing a necessity for the Ottomans. The creditworthiness acquired by the Ottoman Empire in the eyes of European investors as a result of the international agreements of 1856 at the end of the Crimean War meant that Istanbul could avail itself of larger loans floated in Paris and London to the Tanzimat reform process. The British-run Imperial Ottoman Bank was established in 1856 and amalgamated with French interests in 1863, serving to reinforce traditional relations with Istanbul and giving France, too, a strong incentive to maintain the empire. And the salience of all of these rather involved economic and financial details will become apparent in a moment. As the 1838 trade agreement and the 1839 Tanzimat Reform Decree were linked, so the 1856 Treaty of Paris, concluding the Crimean War, incorporated reference to the 1856 Tanzimat Reform Decree, which itself was especially strongly oriented towards Muslim, non-Muslim equality under the influence of the British ambassador Stratford Canning. Now, the 1856 Treaty of Paris thereby created some space for future external intervention in Ottoman affairs to enforce the promised Tanzimat reforms if they were not enacted from within. At the same time, the Ottoman Empire was admitted to the European Concert of Powers formally, giving it a more equal status, and Britain, France and Austria guaranteed by treaty the integrity of the Ottoman lands. Lord Palmerston went further and opposed the establishment by the treaty of any machinery of great power supervision and enforcement of reforms for non-Muslims, because this might portend future Russian intervention. We need to explain that. Debilitating any capacity to enforce those reforms, we perhaps looked at the words of Lord John Russell, British Secretary from 1965. For Russell, the major benefit of the Treaty of Paris regarding the Ottoman Christians was that it had confirmed the removal of the sort of exclusive privilege that they tried to arrogate to themselves since 1774. So these, in inverted commas, achievements of 1856, from the British perspective, highlighted something of a structural contradiction in the British desire, on one hand, to sustain the Ottoman Empire, and on the other hand, to press pro-Christian reforms on Istanbul. Britain's history of protection of the Ottoman in Europe showed that much of this protection was negotiable, as for instance, earlier in the century, when opposing Greek independence had become more trouble than supporting it. On the other hand, not infrequently, Britain would have to support, tacitly or even explicitly, swift Ottoman repression of Christians in order to forestall possible intervention by other powers. Moreover, Britain was keen to discourage minorities from thinking that they could rely on support, since that might only further separatist ambition and thereby undermine Britain's support for the Ottoman Empire. Neither of these two aims was really achieved, as we shall see, but for the time being, in the mid-19th century, or the third quarter of it, the immediate British goal of supporting the Ottoman Empire tended to eclipse aims relating to its encouraging reform into a self-sustaining and more egalitarian policy where secession was less likely. The die of policy was cast through, for instance, the massacres of Lebanese and Syrian Christians in 1860, Cretan massacres of 1866-67, beginning of Russian reassertiveness in the so-called Eastern Crisis of 1875-8. During that crisis, as we'll now see, many of the domains were torn away and territory was lost by the Ottoman Empire to Russia in the Caucasus. With the Eastern Crisis, which in some ways represents the end of much of the Ottoman Empire in Europe, British policy had once again to be retuned. This is what we might call the internationalization, the full internationalization of the Armenian question specifically, as opposed to the Christian question generally. The 1856 reform decrees, both internal and at Paris, sort of internationalized the question of Christian reform as generically sort of non-Muslim Christian reforms. The 1878, the end of the 1878, of the Eastern Crisis, which ends in 1878, the Berlin Treaty that brings that to a conclusion, was the Armenians specifically mentioned. Treaty. So this is the internationalization of the Armenian question specifically. Now, British policy had always been more anti-Russian than pro-Ottoman, for, after all, you heard this in Peggy's lecture, some of these Christian conscious British cabinets were shaken by ongoing anti-Christian abuses, and no more so than during the so-called the Bulgarian atrocities of 1876. I should say parenthetically that while those atrocities were very real, the concern manifested for the plight of Christians did not extend to the brutality of insurgent Christian irregular forces, or their Russian protectors, or their Balkan successor states. That's parenthetic. So, after the Crimean War, to return to the question of British attitude, serious British sacrifice to support an Ottoman state that had seemingly failed to help itself would be increasingly controversial in public discourse, particularly if this meant bolstering Istanbul's rule over Christian peoples. It's important also to remember that up to the Eastern Crisis of 1875-8, when in Britain they talked about suffering Christianity in the Ottoman domains, this generally conjured up images of Slavs or Greeks, for instance, in the Ottoman European dominions. Considerations about suffering Christianity on one hand with foreign political orthodoxy of sustaining the Ottoman Empire on the other. In 1878, Benjamin Disraeli's Foreign Secretary, Lord Salisbury, determined, a solution to the so-called Eastern Crisis, that Britain's commitment now was only to defend the Asian dominions of the empire, and of course the Straits, the Dardanelles against Russia. So Britain's commitment was modified at this point to defending what the British call the Asian dominions of the empire. By this they mean, primarily for our purposes, Anatolia. That's the sort of, in Anatolia, after all, the population was, taken as a whole, predominantly Muslim. The Armenians themselves were in the most difficult position, living in precisely the region that Britain was most determined to see maintained within the Ottoman Empire. The Tanzimat years had seen some in the situation of Muslims, but as a whole, by no means for the better. In some places, yes, in some places, no. Since the reforms had aroused much Muslim resentment, I'm using Muslim, much too generalistic a term there, but the reforms, for instance, helped fracture client-protector relationships, again, protector perhaps in inverted commas, between Kurdish landlords and chieftains on one hand and Armenian peasants on the other. While the inflow of Muslim refugees from the Russian-controlled Caucasus and now also the Balkans created competition for land, often manifest as simple expropriation of Armenians with massive attendant abuses. Certainly that inflow of muhajirs or refugees introduced an often vengeful, new anti-Christian element to Eastern Anatolian life. Elements of the Ottoman elite too resented the way in which the reshaping of the internal religious order of the empire had been influenced by external Christian powers. Now, Armenian reform acquired a new urgency during the Russo-Turkish War of 1877-8, the decisive act, as it were, of the Eastern Crisis. In that conflict, taking advantage of the breakdown of state authority, Ottoman and Persian Kurds, including, I think, some irregulars in the Ottoman armies, murdered thousands of Armenians in the regions bordering Russia and Persia. Accordingly, the advance of the Russian troops into Eastern Anatolia, with some Russian Armenian generals at their head, brought security of life, not to mention Russian imperial rhetoric about liberation from the Ottoman yoke. Armenian Patriarch Nerses Vazavetian drew the obvious conclusion from the traditions of international horseplay over the Eastern question and opened channels of communication with Britain and Russia. He pressed both powers to the end of administrative autonomy in the Armenian provinces, threatening the British that unsatisfied Armenian aspirations would lead to future agitation, resulting in annexation to Russia, possibly. I should say, Russia preferred the prospect of indirect influence in the Armenian provinces, as opposed to full Armenian autonomy, because it was concerned about the impact of an independent, formerly Ottoman Armenia on the sentiment of Armenians in the Russian-ruled Caucasus. So Russia doesn't want fully independent Armenia, but wants influence there. Britain wants to minimize Russian influence there. British diplomats not only saw danger in Russian influence in Armenia, but felt it inevitable that any autonomous region would fall prey to Russia at some point. As well as pointing, in this sense, quite honestly, to the demographic problems of a Christian-administered state, and also autonomous Armenia with a majority Muslim population, which would have been the case. Explains the British figure in 1878 in pressing to alter the proposed terms of the peace settlement away from any question of autonomy and towards simple reforms addressing such issues as Kurdish and Circassian depredations against the Armenians. Britain negotiated hard to reduce Russia's wartime territorial gains in northeastern Anatolia, and guarantee British military support for the Ottomans in the case of future Russian aggression. Yet Russia still incorporated Caucasus territories, Kars, Ardahan, Batum, with a significant Armenian population. And so Britain also had to find some method of combating the Tsarist rhetoric of liberating Christian Armenians. Following the 1856 practice of internationalizing the Christian question to take it out of Russian control, when the Armenian question per se raised its head in 1875-8, the British were instrumental in making that too an international affair through the mechanism of the Anglo-Ottoman Cyprus Convention, which so influenced the shape of the decisive Berlin Treaty of 1878. The British actually managed to acquire for themselves a disproportionate responsibility to oversee the implementation of Armenian reforms. To this end, a series of military consuls were dispatched to East. But apart from those few people, no European manpower was stipulated to substitute for the erstwhile Russian presence. The presence of the British consuls in turn raised Russian suspicions about British ambitions in Anatolia. It introduced an entirely new, even if not very effective, element into the British representation in the area. Meanwhile, the regime of the new Ottoman Sultan, Abdulhamid II, was utterly opposed to the consul's influence as an infringement of his sovereignty. From the early 1880s, the reformed Three Emperors Union of Germany, Russia, and Austria-Hungary signified to Gladstone's new British ministry that reforms should not. The Armenians were for a while left in stasis.
Gladstone and his predecessor Disraeli. Hello? I think this has gone.
Yeah.
This has gone off. Hasn't it? Yeah.
Yes.
Taking some exercises, breathing exercise. Where are we? Yeah. Gladstone and his predecessor Disraeli had in any case forfeited a lot of influence in Istanbul, firstly because of Gladstone's anti-Turkish rhetoric, secondly by the British failure to uphold the Ottoman rule in Europe, and thirdly, British commandeering of Cyprus as a base of direct British influence in the Eastern Mediterranean. Ottoman disillusionment would only be confirmed when in 1882 Gladstone occupied Egypt. Yet for Britain, this too was all part of the Great Imperium, with the Suez Canal, with the Dardanelles secure and domination over Egypt, along with a controlling share in the new Suez Canal, giving Britain a commanding position over another approach to India. The need for a quiescent Istanbul was no longer so pressing from Britain's perspective. Now, my fear is that periodic but distinctly tentative British pressure, or qualified British pressure on Istanbul for implementation of reforms, led many Ottoman Christians, especially Armenians, to keep appealing to the powers with no real chance of success, while angering the Ottoman authorities that were increasingly sensitive to signs of perceived internal disloyalty or ingratitude. Former Patriarch Khrimian returned from negotiating in Berlin to make a famous speech contrasting the violent, ostentatious and successful methods of the Balkan revolutionaries, especially the Bulgarians, with the pacific and unsuccessful methods of the Armenians. Nevertheless, for the Ottomans, the fact that Armenian leaders had solicited the intervention of the powers made them instant objects of suspicion, like the Bulgarians and the Greeks before them. These Ottoman suspicions would only grow with the establishment in the next decade of new Armenian political parties with varying agendas for reform and possible regional autonomy in eastern Anatolia. Thus, the international Armenian question was born as the general diplomatic Eastern question intersected with the agrarian question that Stefan's talked about, the question of land ownership in particular, the question of demographic change in Anatolia with the advent of Muslim refugees, and the development of more Armenian reform demands from nationalist and socialist political parties. From the Ottoman perspective, the territorial losses of the Eastern crisis signaled that some other solution to Ottoman decline needed to be found, and it took the shape of the so-called pan-Islamic policies of Abdul Hamid II, which brings me to the context in which the great massacres of the 1890s occurred. In the field of foreign affairs, Abdul Hamid originally looked to pursue a neutral policy towards the powers. Yet as international tensions and polarizations increased in the 1890s, he increasingly looked to play one off against the other. Germany, though it would never commit by treaty to the defense of the Ottoman Empire, was used as a foil on one hand to the lapsed ally Russia, to Germany's lapsed ally Russia, and on the other hand to Britain, of whom the Sultan was highly resentful after successive interventions and the loss of Cyprus and Egypt. While recognizing German strategic and economic goals in the Near East, in inverted commas again, Sultan believed Berlin's intimations that this influence would never be translated into intervention in Ottoman internal affairs. Thus, Germany was useful, Abdul Hamid felt, in resisting external pressure for Armenian and Macedonian reforms. Now, the Sassoon massacres, of which you'll be well acquainted in 1894, triggered a chain of events which brought back into the whole sort of panoply of external attention to Ottoman policies towards and the treatment of non-Muslims in the Ottoman Empire. British pressure, in light of the Sassoon massacres of 1894, resulted in Russian participation in an Ottoman investigative commission, which in turn led to a British proposal in May 1895 for new reforms, and I quote, to give security and contentment to the Armenians, them a fair share in the administration of the 6 Armenian provinces. The proposal also suggested forming the provinces administrative unit to be overseen by a European appointed control commission. This predictably met with formidable opposition from Istanbul. The next significant link in the chain of events came when a Hunchak party organised demonstration in Istanbul on the 30th of September 18 to emphasise the reform demands more to the great powers than to the Sublime Porte. The killings of hundreds of Armenians in the provincial centre of Trabzon on the Black Sea and greatly agitated inter-ethnic tensions across the empire. But Yelevahi would argue, and I think I probably agree, that the most single catalyst to the general massacres that were to begin within a few weeks was the Sultan's capitulation on the 17th of October 1895 to the reform demands. That was the catalyst, the truly huge massacres, the massacres that take up the vast majority of the death toll of these periods, and late autumn and winter of 1895 to 6. There's one further final episode to accounts for the final series of massacres in late summer 1896, and I'll touch on that now. I'm conscious I'm running out of time. In August 1896, the Armenian Revolutionary Federation staged a remarkable coup in Istanbul. The revolutionaries had chosen their target carefully. It was the headquarters of the Imperial Ottoman Bank, the seat of foreign capital and economic control of the Ottoman Empire. This was an obvious signal plea for further external intervention. Their demand was autonomy of the 6 provinces. Their threat was to blow up the bank. Remarkably, the Armenian Revolutionary Federation men tried to escape unharmed as a result of some French intervention, but the state had its revenge against thousands of ordinary Armenians in the area. Now, obviously, the massacres of the 1895 to 6 had aroused as much British public outrage and sympathy as had the earlier Bulgarian atrocities. But Britain's global position now meant that on one hand, the Prime Minister Salisbury could express his distaste openly and without reservation. But on the other hand, the very fact that he could express that openly and without reservation showed how weak his influence was in Istanbul. There was nothing he could do about it. When it became clear that no other power was prepared to risk the existing balance of power to force the Sultan to bring an end to the 1895 massacres, Salisbury even whimsically mooted sending British warships through the Dardanelles. In the event, Abdul Hamid could pursue his dilatory policies, claiming that reforms could only be introduced when his realm had been fully pacified. Having fought to take the Armenian lands out of Russian hands as Disraeli's foreign secretary in 1878, in 1895 to 6, Salisbury, as Prime Minister, would have been only to Russian cooperation in forcing the Sultan's hand, perhaps, rhetorically certainly. Yet by the combination of its earlier Armenian and imperial policies, Britain had alienated not only the Sultan, but also those powers without whose cooperation intervention would not have been possible short of risking European war. Salisbury himself, therefore, finally came to oppose what he called counterproductive threats, arguing, in his words, that the ordinary rules of political science must prevail, i.e., in this case. Now, one might agree, and I think I certainly do, with Gerard Liberidian, that, and I quote at some length, the game of musical chairs played by England, France, Germany, Russia, and so on, alternating as defenders of Ottoman territorial integrity and as protectors of Christian minorities, this game of musical chairs allowed the Sultan's government to exchange its economic prerogatives and many of its sovereign territorial rights in outlying areas for the license to resolve domestic unrest in the core of the empire as it saw fit. Despite the failure to achieve tangible great power intervention in 1896, at its 1898 World Congress, well, just another minute if that's okay, Stefan, the Armenian Revolutionary Federation reaffirmed, I quote, "Without European intervention, it would be impossible to bring to a successful conclusion the struggle to free our people." Such intervention was again and again abortively achieved in another reform plan in 1914. But before that came brief, and as it transpires, entirely false optimism about reform entirely from within, via the Young Turk Revolution, with which the Armenian Revolutionary Federation was initially in sympathy. I'll close the paper there. Thank you.